Hey everyone, and welcome to this video. I'm Glenn, and this is episode 14 of the Oathsworn painting series. In this episode, I'm painting the priest. If you are new to miniature painting, I hope you find this video interesting and helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comment section below. As usual, let's see how I went from a pristine unpainted miniature to this fully painted one. Let's begin. First, I removed all the mold lines by using a hobby knife. Then I assembled the model using glue, excluding the arms. To fill the gaps, I used a mixed sprue glue, and to smooth out the sprue glue, I apply pure glue. The glue is dry, and I clean the model in soapy water, rinse it in clean water and let it dry. Then I primed the model with Chaos Black primer. Next, I used an airbrush to make a censorful light effect by applying a white color from above. This can also be applied by using a can of white primer. Now we're all set and good to go. I prepare a few speed paints on the palette, aiming to give the armor a blue and greenish tone. I don't think too much about where the paints are applied, it's more or less random, to add variation and make the armor look more interesting. I use a few different mixes for this. The first one is plasmatic bolt mixed with palette bone. I use a cheap synthetic brush when applying speed paints as base coats. The second mix consists of plasmatic bolt, Gravelord Grey and palette bone. And the third mix is plasmatic bolt mixed with periwinkle purple. I had the same issue as with the Venerator. The paint don't seem to adhere. I might have had too much water on the brush after rinsing it, or I didn't shake the paint properly. I will add more speed paint on top in a later step to solve this issue. Continuing with the rest of the armor, I applied the different mixes in a somewhat random pattern. For the hammer handle, I went with periwinkle purple. And for the metal on the hammerhead, I apply a mix of periwinkle purple and Gravelord Grey. I move on to the leather, the chains and the book, and use a mix of hardened leather and Gravelord Grey. In addition to the brown mix, I also apply a small amount of purple on the book cover. For the loincloth, hood and cape, I use a mix of 3 parts periwinkle purple and 1 part hive dweller purple. As I mentioned earlier, the result is pale as the paint didn't adhere properly. I let it dry and apply more speed paints on top using the same colors and mixes. I start with the fabrics using the purple mix. Then the leather, chains and book using the brown mix. In addition to the brown mix, I apply a small amount of purple again. This time I went with a more bluish tone on his left and a more greenish tone on his right. This is done using the same process and paints as previously. For the boots I incorporate shades of purple. In general I don't think too much about where the paints are applied. It's random to create this variation on the armor. I actually went over the fabrics a third time as I wasn't satisfied with the tone of color. I also went over the hammer's handle and metal parts a second time. I apply a touch of purple to the face and hands. For the base I use a range of colors. They are applied randomly onto the base and blended together. It may look a bit strange at this point, but I decided to dive right in and see if I could make it look interesting. Now I begin layer and highlight the model, starting with serious purple on the fabrics. I focus on coloring the exposed areas and edges, leaving a darker tone in the recesses and shadows of the model. Next I tried something different. Using a sponge, I added medium gunship grey to the fabrics to create some texture. But as you'll see later, this step becomes nearly invisible on the fabrics due to the further layers of paint. To blend the grey into the fabrics, I use Sirius Purple again as a thin layer. The next layer is a mix of purple, grey and off-white. I focus more on the edges on the fabrics and on the top of the hood. Here I apply some textures to the edges. Now I add more white into the mix and apply this to the hood and the edges of the cape. To tie everything together, I use a mix of 3 parts periwinkle purple, 1 part hive dweller purple, and 4 parts speed paint medium. This is applied to all the fabrics as a thin layer. Here I rinse the brush to soak up some of the excess paint. The speed paint is dry, and as the final highlight on the fabrics, I use a mix similar to the previous step, and focus on the exposed areas and edges. When painting the more flat surfaces on the cape, I alter between the different tones to create a nice transition. Here I mix in a bit more Oathsworn grey, ensuring the highlight isn't too bright. I focus mainly on the edges. With the fabrics done, the model looks something like this. I proceed to the leather parts, starting with scrag brown. Using a stippling motion, I apply the paint, incorporating small scratches and painting random folds on the back. This technique enhances texture and imparts a worn appearance to the leather. Additionally, I highlight along the edges. The next color is Jucaro Orange. I use the same process but focus more on the edges and narrow down the highlights. I follow up with the last highlight with more cast bone. I use Rhinox hide mixed with Scrag brown to clean up some of the shaded areas. On the book's cover are stipple on tones of purple, grey, off-white and brown. And for the pages I use XV88 and Morkar's Bone. I coat the chains and Thuribles with Rhinox hide, and now I begin layering them with Ducaro orange. I follow up with a mix of Ducaro orange and Oathsworn grey for highlights. I create some focal points on the chains and the Thuribles. Then I apply a small amount of Fire Giant orange to add a more orange tint. Here I rinse the brush to soak up some of the excess paint. And for the final highlights, I use pure white. For the underside of the Thuribles, I use Ducaro orange, Lauren Forest and Oathsworn grey, and use a similar process. For the symbol on the book, its corners and the two bits on its back, I use the same process as on the chains and Thuribles, and apply the final highlight with pure white. Let's move on to the armor, which I'll paint using the non-metallic metal method. The boots and chainmail ended up a bit too green for my liking, so I applied a thin layer of Dark Reaper over these areas. Then I start to layer and highlight the armor parts. I use tones of Dark Reaper and Oathsworn Grey. Here I incorporate Ghost Green as a highlight. I use Oathsworn Grey to amp up the highlights. I use Sirius Purple on the metal parts close to the fabrics to make it look like a reflection. I also use the speed paints I used as a base coat, Periwinkle Purple and Plasmatic Bolt. These are applied either separately or mixed together. This helps shade and blend the colors to achieve a nice transition or gradient, and also allows me to correct mistakes along the way. When I'm satisfied with the highlights built up through a steady layering process using a range of colors, I finish them off with a touch of pure white. I painted the armor plates on the sides using a similar process. The same applies for the chainmail and the buckles. For the chest plate, my goal is to create a vertical focal point. I begin by gradually highlighting this area, using the same method as before. By layering and blending between the various colors, I build up the focal point to achieve a smooth transition or gradient. Periwinkle purple is used to shade and create this gradient effect. The focal point is done and I apply the last highlights with pure white. For the armor on the arms, I use a similar process again, creating a few highlights along the arms. Under the left arm, I apply a reflection with tones of XV88 and Oathsworn Grey and use periwinkle purple as a shade. Let's proceed to some freehand work on the Pauldron. I start by dividing the shoulder into sections using Oathsworn Grey for the guidelines. I twist and turn the model so I can paint towards myself, which helps maintain precision. I had to adjust the section a bit, so I painted a new line and corrected the mistake by applying either periwinkle purple or plasmatic bolts. Messing up the alignment of the sections is not the end of the world. You can simply repaint over the mistakes. Next, I divide this area into even smaller sections using a smaller brush and begin painting triangles with the lines as the centers. It's a slow and steady process, but the result is worth it. I refine all the triangles by alternating between periwinkle purple and Oathsworn Grey to create sharp edges. Next, I highlight the section at the end of the Pauldron, using the same process as on the other armor parts. I ensure there is a well-defined shade between the sections with the triangles and the end of the pauldron, creating the appearance of a gap or recess with two distinct edges. I revisit the triangles once more to refine and define them even further, aiming for a crisp and clear appearance by using white. Here I adjust the edge of the section, using a mix of periwinkle purple and plasmatic bold. I place a guideline aligned with the highlight on the other shoulder. Then I define the next section on the pauldron and create a gap between the sections. I add one more guideline along the pauldron and clean up the guideline across to create a sharper edge. Next, I continue to create the focal point along the pauldron. I apply the rule of cool by adding an extra highlight, as the pauldron is slightly angled compared to the other one. Now I paint the other edge, leaving a gap between, and continue highlighting the focal points, ensuring they are aligned and follow the shape of the pauldron. For the small decoration, I use periwinkle purple to define it by shading around it, and highlight it using the range of colors for the armor. In general, I highlight the edges of the pauldron. If needed, you can use darker tones between the focal points to create a nice transition or gradient. I return to the triangles to define the edges and apply shading and highlights to their surfaces. This process is based on the previously added focal points and follow the shape of the pauldron. As a cool addition to the pauldron, I apply some rune-like letters. After that, I decided to amp up the corner of the pauldron to create a focal point around this area in general, including the chest plate, to draw some attention to his face. For some more cool details, I add small crosses with Yukari orange on the blue triangles and highlight them with Yukari orange mixed with Oathsworn grey. I follow up with small crosses on the other triangles using a light mix of Dark Reaper and Oathsworn grey and highlight them with pure white. As with everything else in non-metallic metal, it's a process. Going back and forth between the colors to create nice transitions and gradients is key. On the hammer, I paint highlights along the handle using tones of periwinkle purple, Sirius purple, Oathsworn grey and white. And for the hammerhead, I paint the metal parts using the tones of Dark Reaper and Oathsworn grey, and white for the final highlight. I paint some scratches with Oathsworn grey and add a dark line below with a black color to create a shade. I clean up the stone using white. Next I apply a mix of serious purple and black with a sponge to create a sporadic pattern. Then I use a brush to connect some of the spots with thin jagged lines. Using white again, I clean up some areas and apply it somewhat randomly overall to blend the veins into the stone. I return to the mix of purple and black to define some of the veins. And repeat the process with white, applying it randomly to further blend the veins into the stone. I apply a mix of 4 parts speed paint medium and 2 parts Gravelord grey to shade the bottom and the sides of the hammer, leaving out the top. Next I use white again to clean up some areas, making them appear more white and blending some of the veins for variation and depth. I focus primarily on the top of the hammerhead, but also extend this process to the sides. Returning to the mix of purple and black, I define some of the veins further. As the final step on the hammer, I use white with a focus on the top to create clean white areas and blend the veins into the stone. This layered process results in a nicely textured marble effect. With the marble hammer complete and ready to vanquish the Deepwood creatures, we move on to a crucial part of this model, the beard. The purple undertone is great for the face overall. I layer the beard and eyebrows with Oathsworn grey and white. Next, I gradually paint the face and hands using Bogman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone, Kislev Flesh and Pale Flesh. I start with Bogman's Glow as a base coat, and with each new layer I focus more on the exposed and raised areas. I apply a dot in the eye sockets with Oathsworn Grey. And clean up the beard. I paint the lip using Bugman's Glow. And highlight with Kislev flesh mixed with pale flesh. I apply a small amount of Hive Dweller purple into the eye sockets. I rinse the brush to soak up some of the excess paint. This dude has seen his fair share of Deepwood, so let's add a battle scar to his face. As they say in Cistercia, with a great beard comes great responsibility. With the face complete, let's proceed to some freehand work on the loincloth. This part was a bit tricky because the cloth isn't completely straight. I had to visualize how the imple or crest would fold on the loincloth and paint it accordingly. I start by drawing a guideline in the center. Looking back, I should just have used a pencil. To correct or remove the guideline, I used Sirius purple overall and mixed in some black if needed. Next I use Emperor's Children to paint the crest, aiming for the artwork. After sketching, I begin defining the crest. I use Screamer Pink to shade the crest in less exposed areas and Emperor's Children for the lighter areas. I also use a mix of these paints. For highlighting, I apply a mix of Emperor's Children and Pale Flesh. To divide and define the symbol, I use a mix of Sirius Purple and Black. Finally, for the last highlight, I add more Pale Flesh into the mix. I made a small correction to the lower arrow connected to the crest, where one of the lines was slightly off. We are almost done, with the base as the final step. I layer and highlight it using tones of grey, green, brown, yellow and off-white, as demonstrated in my other videos. I also paint some details using the purple and pink colors. I go the 2 laps around the base rim with a black color. Afterwards, I attach a few tufts, leaves and flowers using superglue. Lastly, I applied Matt Varnish for a matte finish and to protect the paints. If you have watched this painting guide from start to finish, you are a true Chronicle scribe. Now, Let's have a look at the final result.
I stand as a testament to the enduring faith that courses through my veins. My faith faces persecution, division, and doubt, but I carry within me the belief in the miracles of the Way. I harbor no ill will for the High Church. They deny miracles of healing, for they have yet to witness its true potential. Within the Free Company's haven, I am beyond the Church's grasp. Here, I wield my hammer and steel as an extension of my faith, forging my convictions in the fires of action. Humanity stands at the precipice, gazing into the darkness of the Deepwood. The painting chronicles brotherhood stands as a beacon of light, ready to illuminate the way forward. Join us by subscribing, and we shall triumph together.
What is this? Is my penance finally complete? Wait, priest, where in the deepest of woods have you been? We've been waiting 14 episodes for you.
Also, like and comment, please.
That's my line. Get me down from here, priest!